Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here asking you to quickly hit like and subscribe and the notification bell before we start. Also, don't forget to leave a comment saying where you're listening from or just drop the I'm doing my part meme. Life is too short to be ordinary. These were the final words Yingying Zhang wrote in her diary, a simple, optimistic sentence that would soon become a haunting epitaph. In the spring of 2017, the 26-year-old visiting scholar was the embodiment of extraordinary promise. Having arrived at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign just weeks earlier, she was pursuing her dream of becoming a professor. She was conducting postgraduate research in agricultural sciences that she hoped would one day allow her to return to China and support her working-class parents. June 9, 2017, was a clear summer afternoon in Urbana, Illinois. For Yingying, it was a day of simple errands. She was on her way to sign a lease for a new apartment, a step toward settling into her new life abroad. Running late, she sent a text message to the apartment manager at 1:39, letting them know she would arrive around 2:10. After getting off one bus at 1:52 p.m., she hurried to a corner to catch her transfer. She tried to flag it down, but she was on the wrong side of the street, and the bus drove past without stopping. It was a minor, frustrating moment of the sort that happens every day. Unfortunately for this bright young woman, this seemingly insignificant event would start the chain of events that would directly end her life. Undeterred, Yingying walked a few blocks to another bus stop on North Goodwin Avenue, a public, well-trafficked area on campus. The location itself seemed to offer a layer of security. After all, this wasn't a dark alley or a deserted road, but the heart of a bustling university in the middle of the afternoon. At 2 p.m., a surveillance camera recorded a black Saturn Astra driving past her. The car circled the block and 3 minutes later pulled up beside her. Yingying spoke to the driver for about a minute. Then, at 2:04 p.m., she stepped off the curb and got into the passenger seat. The car pulled away, and Yingying Zhang was never seen again. When the apartment manager texted her at 2:38 p.m., there was no reply. As hours turned into evening, her friends and colleagues grew frantic. Calls to her phone went unanswered. At 9:24 p.m., an associate professor officially reported her missing to the University of Illinois Police. The initial days of the investigation were a flurry of activity. The University of Illinois Police and the FBI launched a joint task force, while the campus's student population mobilized, coordinating search parties and distributing flyers. The university and Crime Stoppers offered a reward that quickly grew to $50,000 for any information leading to her whereabouts. Yingying's family flew in from China, vowing not to leave the United States without their daughter. The investigation's first major clue came from the surveillance footage that captured her last moments. The video was grainy, and the car's license plate was unreadable, a frustrating dead end. However, investigators were able to identify the vehicle as a black Saturn Astra. They compiled a list of all 18 registered owners of that specific model in Champaign County. One of them was Brent Christensen, a 27-year-old former physics PhD student at the same university. When first questioned on June 12th, Christensen told investigators he couldn't remember his whereabouts on the day of the disappearance, suggesting he was playing video games, but investigators were persistent. On June 14th, they re-examined the surveillance footage with fresh eyes. This time, they noticed a small, seemingly insignificant detail. The car in the video had a cracked front passenger side hubcap. When they went back to inspect Christensen's vehicle, they found the exact same flaw. It was the critical link they needed, a piece of classic observational police work that unlocked the digital evidence. Armed with this new information, the FBI brought Christensen in for questioning again on June 15th. This time his story changed. He admitted to picking up an Asian woman who seemed distressed, but he claimed she panicked when he made a wrong turn, so he let her out of his car just a few blocks later. It was a lie, and investigators knew it. During a search of his car, they noted that the passenger door appeared to have been cleaned far more meticulously than the rest of the vehicle. This was a clear and obvious sign of a potential effort to destroy evidence. As they dug deeper, a chilling portrait of the predator, who had been hiding in plain sight, began to emerge. Christensen's life was unraveling. He was dealing with a failed marriage, drinking way too much, and had dropped out of his doctoral program. But beneath this surface-level turmoil was a dark, escalating fantasy life he had meticulously documented online. His internet history revealed a disturbing obsession with Ted Bundy, and he openly fantasized about achieving similar infamy. He was an active user on a fetish website, where he frequented forums like Abduction 101 and read guides on planning a perfect abduction fantasy. His search history included topics like decomposition, and he had downloaded images of mostly Asian women bound and gagged. With Christensen identified as the prime suspect, the FBI placed him under 24-hour surveillance. They knew he was their man, but without a body or a confession, their case was circumstantial. Their breakthrough came from an unlikely source: Christensen's own girlfriend, Tara Bullis. Approached by agents, she agreed to cooperate, hoping that if she could get him to talk, she might prove his innocence. She began wearing a wire, secretly recording their conversations for the FBI. The investigation reached its horrifying climax on June 29, 2017. A memorial walk and concert was being held on campus to honor Ying Ying, who was still officially considered a missing person. In an act of staggering audacity, Brent Christensen decided to attend, bringing Tara with him. If Christensen was the criminal mastermind he believed himself to be, he may have played his cards differently here. Thankfully for the cause of justice, and for Ying Ying and her family, he wasn't quite so brilliant. Surrounded by hundreds of people mourning his victim, Christensen, who knew he was being watched by the FBI, couldn't contain his narcissistic pride. His ego, his need to be recognized for what he had done, overrode any instinct for self-preservation. On the walk, with the FBI's recording device capturing every word, he began to confess. He bragged that Ying Ying was his 13th victim, a claim investigators have never been able to substantiate, and that he was a successful serial predator. He described how he had posed as an undercover officer to lure Ying Ying into his car, a tactic he had tried on another young woman earlier that same day. He then recounted, in chillingly casual detail, how he took her back to his apartment, where he played out his sick fantasies before decapitating her. He marveled at how she fought for her life, calling her supernatural in her resilience. He boasted that her family, who had traveled across the world to find her, wouldn't even get her remains. The next day, on June 30th, Brent Christensen was clapped in cuffs. The federal trial of Brent Christensen began in June 2019. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented the surveillance video and the forensic evidence from Christensen's apartment. Bloodstains on his mattress and carpet were a DNA match to Ying Ying. The centerpiece, however, was the set of horrifying secret recordings. The jury listened as Christensen's own voice filled the courtroom, describing the gruesome slaying of the young woman whose family sat just feet away. Faced with this mountain of irrefutable evidence, the defense made a stunning and calculated decision. In his opening statement, the defense attorney stood before the jury and admitted what Christensen had done. It wasn't a surrender, but a strategic pivot. Knowing an acquittal was impossible, the defense conceded guilt on the very first day to shift the trial's focus. Their entire case was an argument against the death penalty, portraying him as a man who had lost a battle with his own demons. In this way, The defense intended to turn the state's evidence of Christensen's online activity into a means to spare him from being condemned. They claimed that he was a man consumed by substance abuse and mental illness, whose life had spiraled out of control. After deliberating for over 8 hours, the jury returned on July 18, 2019. He was guilty as charged, but that was a given. They announced they were deadlocked, unable to reach the unanimous decision required by federal law to impose the death penalty. As a result, Brent Christensen was automatically sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Upon hearing that his life would be spared, Christensen smiled at his mother. Ying Ying's family sat stoically, their quest for what they considered full justice unfulfilled. For the Zhang family, the life sentence was a devastating blow, but it was compounded by a far deeper and more enduring agony. The body of their daughter has never been found. They have been denied the fundamental closure of bringing her home for a proper burial, a ritual of profound importance in Chinese culture. Christensen's boast that she would never be found was a final act of control, a way to ensure the family's torment would be perpetual. After the trial, information provided by Christensen's lawyers under an immunity agreement finally revealed what he had done with her remains. He had dismembered her body, placed the parts in 3 separate garbage bags, and tossed them into a dumpster outside his apartment. 3 days later, the dumpster's contents were collected, taken to a private landfill, compacted at least twice, and buried under what is now more than 30 feet of trash. Officials have stated that after years of decomposition and compression, her remains could be smaller than a cell phone, making any search effort almost certain to fail. They've also cited the extreme costs associated with the search, given that the case has in essence been fully solved. While it's ultimately unclear if he was telling the truth about this, regardless, the search for her body effectively ended. It was a quiet October morning in 2022 when a chilling discovery shattered the peace of the city of Forest in Virginia. Inside a modest apartment on Madison View Drive, 28-year-old Caitlin Lyon Montgomery, a devoted mother of a young daughter, was found unresponsive by her roommate. What initially seemed like a medical emergency quickly revealed itself as something sinister. Paramedics noticed telltale signs of foul play, tiny hemorrhages in Caitlin's eyes, and linear marks on her neck consistent with strangulation. On her bed, wrapped in a blanket, investigators found a phone charging cord, a mundane item turned into a weapon. The tranquil town had become the scene of a brutal crime, and attention turned to finding who had done this to her. Detectives soon learned that Caitlin had recently ended a tumultuous relationship. Just 1 week before her death, she broke up with her boyfriend, 28-year-old Trenton Fry, but the breakup was far from amicable. In the days leading up to the killing, Fry had allegedly stalked Caitlin. Prosecutors revealed he even searched online for the floor plan of her apartment. On the evening of October 6, 2022, Caitlin and Fry exchanged heated text messages, hinting at an argument in progress. Caitlin was at home in Forest, likely unaware that Fry was lurking nearby despite his claims of being out of town. Around 10 p.m., Caitlin's roommate discovered her unconscious on the bedroom floor, and frantic calls for help ensued. Around that same time, a critical digital clue emerged. Data from Fry's cell phone placed him roughly a mile from Caitlin's home at 10:19 p.m. Just minutes later, he set his phone to navigate to North Carolina. Prosecutors later argued this was the moment Fry slipped away after strangling Caitlin with a charger cord. Caitlin was rushed to Lynchburg General Hospital, but she died from her injuries on October 8th. With clear evidence of strangulation, Investigators immediately viewed Fry as the prime suspect given the recent breakup and the reports of a late-night dispute. When Bedford County deputies contacted Fry by phone on October 7th, while Catlin was still in critical condition, he claimed he knew nothing about what happened. Fry insisted he'd been working in North Carolina on the night of the 6th and didn't even know where Catlin was living. Of course, that story unraveled almost as soon as the evidence came in. Phone records and search warrants quickly undercut Fry's alibi. Instead of being hours away, Fry's phone was placed in the vicinity of Catlin's apartment during the critical window of the crime. His device didn't ping any North Carolina cell towers until about 9:30 the next morning, October 7th. In addition, Fry's employer confirmed he was not working on the night of October 6th or the following day, directly contradicting his statements to police. Sometimes it's a blessing that many criminals are just so dumb. I have to question whether he believed the cops would never check his alibi. Authorities also noted Fry's suspicious behavior after the event. One day after Catlin died, he checked himself into a mental health unit in Greensboro, North Carolina. Detectives saw this as a possible attempt to create some sort of insanity defense. On October 20th, 2022, about 2 weeks after the killing, police arrested Fry in Greensboro. He was initially charged with second-degree charges and was soon extradited back to Virginia to face trial. Fry's trial began in late March 2025 in Bedford County. Prosecutors laid out a narrative of a calculated, premeditated attack, arguing that Fry was an ex-boyfriend who couldn't accept rejection. The evidence showed he had stalked Catlin in the days before her death, even looking up her apartment layout, and then tried to cover his tracks with lies. Jurors heard how Fry's phone movements, the timing of his flight from Virginia, and his own shifting stories all aligned with a cold-blooded plot to kill. In response, Trenton Fry took the rare opportunity to take the stand and offered a different account. Notably, the reason this generally isn't done is because this opens the defendant up to cross-examination. Cross-examination isn't a truth-finding expedition, but rather an opportunity for opposing counsel to win admissions that help their own case and destroy the credibility of the witness. In essence, even people who are 100% innocent can be made to look guilty by an experienced lawyer extracting the proper admissions. But let's get back to the testimony he gave on the stand. He admitted being near Catlin's apartment that night, but claimed it was only because he had a bad feeling and wanted to check on her. According to Fry, he arrived to find first responders at the scene, and without alerting anyone to his presence, panicked and drove back to North Carolina. He admitted that he lied and made up a story about being at work because he believed that the authorities wouldn't believe he wasn't involved. Fry then claimed that he checked into the hospital due to his declining mental state over his fear that he would be arrested for something he didn't do. The defense, for their part, stressed that no DNA or fingerprints placed him inside the apartment, implying that someone else could have been responsible. Without direct forensic proof, they argued, the case was only circumstantial evidence. After several days of testimony, the jury needed only about an hour of deliberation to reach a decision. In April 2025, they found Trenton Fry guilty in the first degree, holding him responsible for Catlin's slaying. The mountain of digital evidence, combined with his pattern of stalking and the web of lies he told investigators, left little room for doubt about his guilt. The defense's insistence that there was no proof Fry entered the apartment couldn't overcome the compelling circumstantial case that pointed squarely to him. Notably, the defense couldn't turn to an alternative set of unknown fingerprints in the apartment to place blame on a potential third party. As the verdict was announced, an emotional wave swept through the courtroom. Catlin's family, who had endured over 2 years of grief and uncertainty, wept and embraced one another in relief. Though nothing could bring her back, They said that seeing Fry held accountable brought a measure of peace. In August 2025, Fry returned to court for sentencing. Though guidelines suggested a decades-long prison term, the judge deemed the crime so heinous that he opted to send Fry to prison for life. The judge called the slaying cold-blooded and calculated, among the worst he had ever seen. This ensured that the now 31-year-old defendant will spend the rest of his life behind bars with no chance of release. Before the sentence was finalized, Catlin's mother and brother described how Fry's actions had devastated their family. Fry offered a brief quote-unquote apology, saying he was truly sorry for their loss. He also claimed that he was sorry for the loss of his former girlfriend as well, effectively maintaining his innocence despite the finding of the jury. It began with a sound. At 4:35 a.m. on June 18, 2021, a 911 call was logged at the Tama County Sheriff's Office in Iowa. The caller, Karina Cooper, was hysterical. She reported that her husband, Ryan Cooper, had been shot and was covered in blood. What dispatchers heard was a portrait of pure panic. What deputies found just 7 minutes later was something else entirely. When the first deputy arrived at the rural Trier home at 4:42 a.m., he walked into a scene that was both tragic and profoundly bizarre. Ryan Cooper, a local farmer, was in his recliner, deceased. An autopsy would later confirm he had been shot twice in the face. The couple's 3 kids were also in the house at the time of the incident. But the most unsettling detail was Karina. She wasn't beside her husband, or on the phone, or trying to render aid. The deputy found her sitting directly on top of her slain husband's body. The scene was immediately suspicious. A single shell casing was recovered, but the weapon was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. The deputy removed Karina and her children from the residence and was immediately suspicious. The stark contradiction between the frantic audio of the 911 call and the unnatural, staged-looking physical evidence at the scene defined the mystery from the very beginning. It was the first clue that what investigators were seeing wasn't the aftermath of a random home invasion, but the curtains raising on a calculated performance. While the scene was loud with suspicion, the case itself fell quiet. For more than 2.5 years, the slaying of Ryan Cooper remained unsolved. To the public, it may have looked like a cold case. For Ryan's family, it was an agonizing wait for justice. That long wait wasn't due to inaction. Rather, it was a complex digital case that needed time. This long gap was spent building a case, not with fingerprints and genetics, but with data. This necessary methodical pace had a major financial consequence, which would actually allow Karina to fund a much more vigorous legal defense. In December 2021, while investigators were deep in digital forensics, Karina Cooper successfully filed a claim for her husband's life insurance, receiving over $500,000. The digital breadcrumbs eventually formed a path. Investigators uncovered a motive as old as time, a secret love affair. Karina Cooper was involved with a younger man, Houston Danker. Their crucial mistake was a faith in digital impermanence. The lovers used Snapchat, likely believing their messages, plans, and fantasies would disappear forever. But investigators recovered them. The chats revealed them fantasizing about marriage, discussing a future, and even planning a new family together. The prosecution argued these messages showed them hatching a plan as early as March 2021. Danker's Google search history was chilling, including queries about the best ways to clandestinely eliminate someone. The digital evidence also created a timeline of the slaying itself, including messages exchanged on the night and morning of June 18th. One of the most damning messages, sent just before the call to the cops, was from Karina to Danker, and I'm going to quote this directly. Remember those casings. With this digital siege engine built, Karina Cooper was finally arrested on February 19th, 2024. Houston Danker was charged 2 months later. The battering ram of justice was about to pound both Cooper and Danker hard. The two co-conspirators took very different legal paths. Houston Danker, facing his own trial, folded. On August 12, 2025, mere moments before jury selection was set to begin, he pled guilty to the first-degree offense. As part of his plea, he admitted to the judge what the prosecution had spent years proving. He and Karina were lovers, and they had planned the slaying together for 4 to 5 months. This confession was a catastrophic blow to Karina Cooper's defense. Her entire case was built on a single premise: Danker acted alone. Her attorneys couldn't deny the affair. The Snapchats were undeniable. So, they tried to reframe it. In a remarkably short opening statement, her lawyer mentioned Houston Danker's name 11 times, painting him as a manipulative lover and Karina as a victim. The defense argued she wasn't a co-conspirator. She was a, quote, idiot living in a fantasy world. But with Danker's own sworn confession already on the record, this dream world defense was, from day one, a legal fantasy. Karina Cooper took the stand, a high-stakes gamble to sell her dream world narrative directly to the jury. She testified that her relationship with Danker was just an online fantasy. She pointed the finger squarely at her former lover, claiming he had talked about slaying Ryan several times, and that she believed he was the one who pulled the trigger. But she had to answer the case's biggest question. If she knew he was dangerous, why did she lie to police for 2.5 years? Her answer was fear. She claimed that after the slaying, Danker threatened her and her children, and she was too terrified to tell the truth. The prosecution's cross-examination was fiery and relentless, and I have to question why the defense put such a dubious witness on the stand. All but the most saintly people can be made to look like sinister figures if the lawyer cross-examining them is good enough. They highlighted the deep contradictions in her story. Her testimony was a volatile mix of emotions. She appeared to be angry when questioned on cross-examination, yet broke down in tears while being forced to read her own incriminating Snapchat messages aloud in court. For the jury, this performance may have fatally echoed the 911 call. They had to reconcile the woman on the stand claiming to be a terrified victim with the digital evidence showing her as an active, planning participant. The tears, like the hysteria on the 911 call, failed to create reasonable doubt. After 6 days of testimony, they deliberated for just over 3 hours, and unsurprisingly, she was found guilty as charged. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence in Iowa, and on September 19th, 2025, Karina Cooper was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Danker, for his part, received the same sentence, ensuring that these former lovebirds were now 2 jailbirds, caged up in different parts of the state. The criminal trial was over, but one piece of justice remained. One of the motives for the crime, the insurance policy, was still in Karina's possession. Ryan's estate, administered by his siblings, filed a civil lawsuit to claw back the money. This portion of the case is still working its way through the courts as a civil matter, but it's expected that they'll be successful. Unfortunately, though, it's unclear how much of the money remains for her children, who are now without either of their parents. What stands out most to me about this case is how the very tools Karina and her lover believed would protect their secrecy became the instruments of their undoing. In a sense, the case is emblematic of modern justice. The truth might be delayed, but in the age of data, it rarely disappears. These two appear to have really believed that because Snapchat deletes their conversations on the user's end, that there's no record of it kept anywhere. On a warm July night in 1986, 38-year-old Evelyn Aguilar relaxed on her porch with a book at her Florida apartment complex, unaware it would be the last evening of her life. She chatted with friends by phone, even talking about selling some furniture, and later enjoyed dinner and a movie before a late-night swim in the pool. That moment in the pool would be the final time anyone saw her alive. By the next day, Evelyn would be found slain in her own bedroom, the victim of a vicious attack that baffled investigators for decades. On July 14, 1986, a concerned friend noticed Evelyn's apartment door was open and made a grim discovery inside. Evelyn was dead in her bedroom at the San Jose Apartments near Winter Park, Florida, having been brutally attacked. She was viciously assaulted and suffered multiple wounds across her upper body and hands. The medical examiner later confirmed the obvious. Evelyn had been slain in a frenzied, ruthless attack. Investigators at the scene noted a pane of glass had been removed from a window, suggesting the intruder's point of entry, and they recovered palm prints from the interior windowsill. They also recovered male biological material from the scene, which was still of minimal forensic value in 1986. For over 3 decades, Aguilar's family and Seminole County law enforcement refused to give up hope that her attacker would be caught. Over the years, as forensic science advanced, new tests were conducted, but no new suspects emerged. That is, until 2018. That year, 32 years after the event, the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit took a fresh look at Aguilar's file. Detectives submitted the preserved DNA from the crime into the Combined DNA Index System, better known as CODIS, hoping that modern technology could finally crack the case. That renewed effort paid off with a stunning result. The DNA profile from the crime scene hit a match to a man named Danny Emmett. Danny, who was 50 years old in 2019, had unknowingly left his genetic material at the scene. Investigators discovered that back in 2005, Danny had voluntarily given a sample to police during an unrelated assault investigation. Although he wasn't charged then, his DNA was saved in Florida's database. Now, over a decade later, that old sample turned out to be the key to identifying him as the suspect in Aguilar's slaying. Armed with the match, detectives double-checked other evidence for confirmation. Sure enough, Emmett's palm print matched the prints left on Aguilar's windowsill, further cementing the case against him. After 33 years of uncertainty, authorities finally had a name and a face for the likely perp. The investigation that once seemed stalled now had unstoppable momentum. Danny Emmett was only 17 years old at the time of the crime, a local teenager living within walking distance of Evelyn's apartment, and he had never been on the police radar back then. Given his youth and lack of any obvious connection, detectives in 1986 had no idea the perpetrator might be someone literally next door. In hindsight, the perp knew the area well. By his own later admission, he spent time at Aguilar's apartment complex to buy weed and had noticed Aguilar on the second floor. He decided to target her for a robbery one night, and that planned robbery escalated into something much more horrific. Notably, that's his official version of events that hasn't been independently verified by anyone else. Given the crimes he committed, I'd say it's safe to take anything he says with a massive grain of salt. In the decades after the slaying, Danny continued to have run-ins with the law. He amassed more than 30 arrests in what authorities described as a crime-ridden life, yet he had avoided any link to the Aguilar case. By 2019, he was living in Knoxville, Tennessee, and working quietly as a restaurant dishwasher. He likely assumed his terrible deed in 1986 was long buried by time, but he was very wrong. On May 22, 2019, more than 3 decades after Evelyn's death, law enforcement finally caught up with the perpetrator. Acting on an arrest warrant obtained after the genetic hit, Seminole County investigators, with help from Knoxville police, located and arrested the 50-year-old. The long-awaited news brought a surge of relief to those who had waited so many years for answers. 3 of Aguilar's sisters gathered to watch the sheriff announce the breakthrough, an emotional moment after so much time had passed. Danny was promptly charged with first-degree premeditated slaying and burglary in connection with the case. Nearly 37 years after the crime, the case of Eveline Aguilar's slaying finally went before a jury in 2023. Danny Amitt, now in his mid-50s, pleaded not guilty and claimed he had never met Aguilar or been inside her apartment. Forensic evidence told a different story, however, refuting his denials. Prosecutors presented the DNA and fingerprint findings to establish that he was indeed the intruder. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came from Danny's former cellmate, Jeff Murphy, who testified that he had confessed everything. Murphy recounted how Danny calmly described the crime on multiple occasions, claiming that it was all a robbery gone wrong. What disturbed Murphy most was the casual, almost nonchalant manner in which Danny spoke about the crime, as if it were nothing out of the ordinary. The chilling jailhouse confession, combined with the powerful forensic evidence, made for a compelling case against Danny even after so many years. In May 2023, the jury found Danny Amitt guilty of slaying Eveline Aguilar, finally delivering justice for a crime that had haunted her family and community since 1986. The following month, a judge formally sentenced this predator to life in prison, along with a concurrent life term for the burglary charge. Under the terms of the sentence, he must serve at least 25 years before becoming eligible for parole. In February 2020, a 4-year-old Singaporean girl named Megan Kung died, but nobody reported it. Nobody came looking. For 3 agonizing months, her body was hidden in a box, sealed with cement, and stored in a condominium. It was later taken to a workshop, burned in a metal barrel with charcoal, and reduced to ashes that were scattered in the sea. This horrific crime was only discovered 5 months later, not through proactive social work or policing, but because of 2 desperate missing person reports filed on the same day. One was from her maternal grandmother, who had long been worried. The other was from her biological father, Simon Kung, who had just been released from prison and was desperate to find his daughter. What unfolded next revealed not only a story of unimaginable cruelty, but a catastrophic systemic failure that allowed a little girl to be utterly erased. Megan's ordeal wasn't a sudden, isolated event. It was a 13-month escalation of torment at the hands of her biological mother, Fu Li Ping, and Fu's boyfriend, Brian Wong. The couple would hit Megan with a cane, and the injuries were bad enough that in March 2019, staff at her preschool noticed them. They confronted Fu, who admitted to the quote-unquote discipline and was warned that a referral would be made to the Ministry of Social and Family Development if it continued. On September 17, 2019, she withdrew Megan from the preschool, claiming it wasn't teaching her daughter Chinese. This single act effectively removed Megan from public view and from the one place where adults were questioning her injuries. After this, Megan went to live full-time with Fu and Wong, and the situation worsened for the girl. The torment these 2 animals subjected Megan to is beyond disgusting, and I'm not going to get into the specific details in this video. And while I rarely say this, I strongly encourage you not to look up the details for your own mental health. It's all the worst stuff you can imagine, and that's just what they admitted to, so who knows what the full extent of it actually was. On February 21st, 2020, after 13 months of this hell, Brian Wong delivered the final fatal blow in the form of a punch to Megan's stomach. The blow was so strong that it ruptured her internal organs. A forensic pathologist later determined that, in the absence of a body, the probable cause of death was septicemia from the inflammation caused by these ruptures. That said, for the reasons I'm about to describe, this is speculative and based upon the statements given by these monsters themselves. What happened after this punch is perhaps the most chilling part of the story. As Megan lay on the ground, clutching her stomach and complaining of pain, the two adults responsible for her, Fu and Wong, along with a friend, Nouvelle Chu, ignored her. Instead, they went to get high. Hours later, seeing the girl motionless, they tried to resuscitate her, but it was too late. Their priority immediately shifted to self-preservation and a meticulous cover-up. They decided not to report the death to avoid exposure of their crimes. They wrapped Megan's body in a blanket, layers of cling film, and brown tape. They then placed her in a box, which they sealed with cement, and hid in their apartment. For 3 months, they lived with this secret. On May 8, 2020, the trio took the box to an automotive garage. Using a metal barrel and 2 boxes of charcoal, they incinerated Megan's remains. Then, in one last indignity, they gathered the ashes and threw them into the sea at East Coast Park. For 5 months, the world didn't know Megan was gone. The cover-up was, for a time, successful. The case wasn't broken by a single tip-off or a piece of forensics, but by 2 separate police reports filed on the exact same day, July 20th, 2020. The first was from Megan's maternal grandmother, who had been worried for some time and had actually filed a missing person report back in January 2020, a month before Megan was slain. The second was from Megan's biological father, Simon, who was getting the runaround about the status of his daughter. Simon Kung had just been released from prison. Concerned for his daughter's safety and unable to find her, he went to the police to report her missing. These 2 reports coming together finally triggered a full-scale police investigation. After assessing the reports, police quickly established that the girl was no longer alive. Within 4 days, the horrific truth was uncovered. On July 24, 2020, Fu Liping and Brian Wong were arrested, followed by their accomplice, Nouvelle Chu. On July 25, 2020, Fu and Wong were formally charged, a charge that carried the potential for the big DP in Singapore. For years, the case was held up in the courts as everyone involved went through multiple rounds of psychiatric evaluations. The case took a significant turn in February 2025, when the couple pleaded guilty to a range of reduced charges. On April 3, 2025, the court delivered the sentences, which included the practice of judicial caning. Brian Wong was sentenced to a total of 30 years imprisonment and 17 hits with a cane. Notably, while this is intended to be a non-lethal form of punishment, these canings are so severe that the criminals do occasionally perish as a result of the punishment. Fu Liping was sentenced to a total of 19 years imprisonment, and she confirmed she would not appeal. When you look at the punishments these 2 received, it's hard not to feel that they got off astonishingly light. Singapore is a country where the ultimate penalty is still routinely applied for crimes like small-scale substance trafficking. People are sometimes even condemned for amounts that would result in probation elsewhere. Yet here, in a case involving the prolonged torment and slaying of a defenseless innocent, neither Fu nor Wong will ever face that sentence. Wong's 30-year term and 17 strokes of the cane might sound severe on paper, but in practice, it means he'll likely see freedom again while still relatively young. Fu's 19-year sentence is even harder to comprehend. When you compare this to the harsh penalties Singapore imposes for offenses that harm no one, the imbalance is staggering. Personally, a system that can take a life over weed but spares those who destroy a child's life seems morally adrift. Anyway, this one pisses me off. Rest in peace, Megan. You deserved so much better. At 4:48 a.m. on the morning of June 10th, 2016, police in Larimer County, Colorado issued an urgent alert. 18-year-old Ashley Doolittle was missing and feared to be in danger. This kind of pre-dawn bulletin was almost unheard of for a teen who had been gone a few hours. Ashley was due home by 7:30 the night before, but officers had good reason for the alarm. Ashley had recently broken up with her boyfriend, 18-year-old Tanner Flores, and investigators suspected she was with him and that he was armed. By sunrise, a frantic search was underway, and the tight-knit community braced for the worst. Sadly, their darkest fears were soon confirmed. The beloved rodeo queen's bright future had been shattered by a brutal slaying. Ashley Doolittle was a well-known figure in her hometown of Berthoud, Colorado, a rodeo princess and gifted horse rider with an infectious smile. She had been named the lady-in-waiting for the Boulder County Fair and Rodeo, poised to serve as the 2017 rodeo queen. Horses were Ashley's passion from early childhood, and she had won multiple riding championships. At 18 years old, she had just graduated high school and been accepted into Colorado State University's agricultural business program for the fall. Tanner Flores had been Ashley's high school boyfriend for about a year, but she chose to end the relationship as she looked ahead to college and a new life on campus. While this is a usual thing, and many of us have been there, the breakup hit Flores extremely hard. Friends later told investigators that they had never seen him so depressed, and on June 8th he even sent a late-night Snapchat message implying he was gonna off himself. Earlier that day, Flores had gone through Ashley's phone and become upset by messages between her and other male friends. This invasion of privacy led to a furious argument and the final breakup of their on-again, off-again relationship. Flores was hurt and angry, and in the hours that followed he began to formulate a disturbed plan. On June 9th, 2016, Flores persistently pressed Ashley to meet with him, ostensibly to talk things through one last time. That morning, he surreptitiously took his father's revolver from a locker and even drove out near Carter Lake to fire off some test rounds. Ashley, busy with a rodeo event earlier in the day, agreed to meet him later that afternoon. She met Flores at a parking area by Lon Hagler Reservoir in Loveland, expecting a civil conversation. Instead, he drove her to a secluded spot near Carter Lake under the guise of continuing their talk. When Ashley tried to step out of the truck, Flores hit the gas to prevent her escape. In a moment of rage, he reached behind the seat, grabbed the hidden weapon, and shot Ashley point blank inside the truck. He fired multiple times, striking her twice in the head. In an instant, the vibrant young rodeo star was brutally slain by the person she had once trusted most. When Ashley failed to return home on June 9th, her family immediately knew something was wrong. Late that night, her mother reported Ashley missing to the Larimer County Sheriff's Office after finding the teen's car abandoned near Lon Hagler Reservoir. This was the site where she had agreed to meet Flores, raising immediate alarm. Sheriff's deputies quickly learned that Flores had also vanished, and that a weapon was missing from his father's home. Fearing the worst, authorities issued the rare pre-dawn alert and mobilized resources to find the pair. Those investigative efforts paid off within hours. By 8 the next morning, June 10th, authorities had traced Flores's pickup truck to a remote property nearly 300 miles away in Colebran, on Colorado's western slope. A woman living next to that property, formerly owned by Flores's deceased grandfather and then unoccupied, spotted the suspect's white truck in the driveway and observed a disturbing sight. There was a man believed to be Tanner Flores lifting a bundled blanket from the truck's back seat and setting it on the ground. Shockingly, the bag contained what looked like a human arm protruding from the bundle. That was enough for Mesa County authorities to act. The Mesa County Sheriff's SWAT team rushed to the scene, set up a perimeter, and kept watch as Flores moved about the house and yard, even tossing blood-soaked rags into a field. Around 10:30, officers moved in and took Flores into custody. The worst outcome was confirmed when they discovered Ashley's lifeless body wrapped in a blanket in the back of the truck. Under questioning later that day, Flores initially tried to claim that Ashley's death was an accident. He soon recanted and confessed that he had intentionally shot her out of anger. According to an arrest affidavit, Flores admitted shooting Ashley because he was angry with her, describing how he slew her near Carter Lake. He then drove her body to his grandfather's vacant house, where he cleaned her up before returning her to his truck. Flores described how he spent hours at the Colbrand house with Ashley's body, washing her clothes and redressing her before dawn broke on June 10th. He then carried the body back to his truck before law enforcement closed in. Flores was formally arrested on charges related to the crime. What had begun as a missing person case had now become a high-profile homicide investigation. The trial of Tanner Flores took place in late September 2017 in Larimer County, drawing local attention. Flores himself took the witness stand during the week-long trial, tearfully admitting to shooting Ashley, but insisting he had never planned to slay her. His defense attorney echoed that stance, arguing the event wasn't deliberate or premeditated, and urging jurors to consider a lesser charge. Prosecutors, however, presented a starkly different narrative. They laid out evidence that Flores had plotted the crime. From the stolen gun and persistent texts luring Ashley to meet, it all pointed to a calculated act fueled by jealousy and rage. After 6 days of testimony, the jury needed only a short deliberation to reach a verdict. On October 4th, 2017, they found Tanner Flores guilty on all counts. At 19 years old, the man who had taken Ashley's life now faced spending the rest of his own life behind bars. The following day, Flores returned to court for sentencing. Colorado law mandated a life sentence for a first-degree charge. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 32 years for the kidnapping charge. Ashley's family filled the courtroom, and her mother, Ann Doolittle, delivered a poignant statement about the immense loss. She described how Flores's actions had robbed their family of a beloved daughter and all the milestones they would never share, from wedding days to simple everyday moments. Yet, even in her grief, Anne Marie expressed compassion for Flores. She told the court there were no winners in this tragedy and that 2 families had been destroyed. She even extended sympathy to the Flores family, recognizing that they too lost a child in a way, as Tanner's own life was effectively over. Flores, shackled and dressed in an orange jumpsuit, declined to speak when given an opportunity to address the court. It's impossible to walk away from Ashley Doolittle's story without feeling the sheer senselessness of it. This wasn't a situation where tensions escalated over time or where anyone could pretend the ending was inevitable. Ashley was an 18-year-old kid with her whole life opening up in front of her. She broke up with someone because she was ready to move forward, ready to grow, ready to start a new chapter. That's normal. That's healthy. It's virtually a rite of passage to break up with your high school girlfriend or boyfriend at some time after graduation. Flora's actions were the result of someone who couldn't handle rejection, control, or independence. He was someone who had been showing signs for a long time that he was emotionally unstable, obsessive, and volatile. In a way, Tanner was a ticking time bomb. The breakup wasn't the cause, it was the trigger. The danger was already there, simmering under the surface, long before Ashley walked away. And that's the part that sticks with me. This didn't have to happen. It shouldn't have happened. Ashley did nothing wrong. She made a normal, healthy choice, and someone else's inability to handle that choice turned into a nightmare. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you to subscribe and hit the notification bell and turn on all those notifications. Also remember to check out the membership option by clicking join or hit the Patreon link in the description. On an ordinary evening in October 2012, 19-year-old Lizzie Marriott left her job and headed to visit a friend in Dover, New Hampshire. She promised to be home around midnight, but Lizzie never returned. Within days, the University of New Hampshire sophomore's disappearance sparked a frantic search and revealed a disturbing tale of deceit and violence. The same coastal waters Lizzie loved as a marine biology student became the hiding place for a terrible crime. Lizzie was a friendly UNH sophomore living with her aunt and uncle off campus. On the night of October 9th, 2012, after class, she told her family she was going to hang out with some new friends and would be back around midnight. She left campus to meet 18-year-old Kat McDonough, a co-worker friend, at an apartment in Dover. Kat lived there with her 30-year-old boyfriend, Seth Mazzaglia. When Lizzie failed to come home or show up at work the next day, her relatives grew increasingly worried. By October 11th, missing person posters covered the UNH campus as police and volunteers searched urgently for any sign of her. Friends soon told police that Lizzie had planned to visit Kat's apartment on the night she vanished, a fact confirmed by text messages on Lizzie's phone. Acting on this lead, police questioned Kat and Seth on October 12th. Their stories immediately clashed in a very major way. Kat claimed Lizzie never arrived, while Seth eventually admitted that Lizzie had been at their apartment and was now dead. Acting on Seth's information, officers searched the Piscataqua River shoreline at Pierce Island in Portsmouth, where he said they had dumped Lizzie's body. On October 13th, authorities announced that Lizzie was presumed dead, and they arrested Seth Mazzaglia, charging him in her slaying. With Mazzaglia in custody, attention turned to Kat McDonough and what exactly had happened in that apartment. A search of dumpsters near the couple's building yielded evidence like a pair of gloves and some of Lizzie's clothes. Those gloves, Kat later revealed, were worn by Seth when he strangled Lizzie, a chilling sign of premeditation. Forensic testing also found DNA from both Seth and Lizzie on certain items, supporting that an illicit assault had occurred. The pair had also tampered with evidence. Investigators later uncovered that Mazzaglia and McDonough used her phone to send fake text messages as an alibi, and then deleted them to hide their tracks. Initially, Kat stuck to her lie. Days after Lizzie's death, she told an attorney that Lizzie had died accidentally during a consensual act between the two women. Kat remained free for 2 months, even as Lizzie's family demanded answers and justice. Finally, on December 24, 2012, police arrested her for lying to investigators and helping cover up the crime. Facing charges of hindering prosecution and witness tampering, the 19-year-old struck a plea deal in 2013 and agreed to testify against Mazzaglia in exchange for a reduced sentence. She ultimately received a prison term of up to 3 years for her role. Once she began cooperating with authorities, Kat revealed the harrowing truth about that night. She testified that Seth Mazzaglia had coerced her into luring an unsuspecting victim for his violent carnal desires. When Lizzie arrived expecting an innocent movie night, Seth made unwanted advances toward her. Lizzie rebuffed him, and in a fury he attacked. Kat recounted that Seth strangled Lizzie with a rope, even putting on gloves beforehand, and then continued to assault her after she went limp. Kat, who described herself as trapped under Seth's domineering control, did nothing to intervene because she was terrified of him. After the slaying, the couple methodically tried to cover their tracks. They drove to Portsmouth and dumped Lizzie's body into the river at a remote spot on Pierce Island. They then threw the rope, suitcase, and other evidence into dumpsters before abandoning her car back on campus. These actions explained why, despite exhaustive searches, Lizzie's body was never recovered. It had likely been carried away by strong currents. Mazzaglia's trial began in May 2014. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Kat McDonough's testimony. Over about 10 days on the stand, Kat detailed the dark relationship she had with Mazzaglia and the events of Lizzie's final night. Prosecutors bolstered her account with physical evidence, such as the gloves and DNA findings, and with Mazzaglia's own writings. Letters from Mazzaglia revealed his desire to dominate and control Kat without mercy. An expert also testified to explain how Kat could have felt too afraid and isolated to resist him. Notably, Mazzaglia did not testify in his own defense, leaving Kat's account as the primary narrative for jurors to consider. The defense countered with a very different story. Mazzaglia's attorneys claimed that Kat was lying and that Lizzie's death was actually a tragic accident. According to them, this occurred during a consensual encounter between the two women. They argued that Seth's only wrongdoing was helping dispose of the body out of misplaced loyalty to Kat. To support their case, the defense reminded jurors that Kat herself had initially stuck to the accidental suffocation story on video before changing her account. They also observed that this was after she could have confessed everything to the authorities. After less than 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict on June 27, 2014, guilty on all counts. Mazzaglia was convicted of first-degree slaying, as well as an additional charge for committing this act during an illicit assault. He received the mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the August 2014 sentencing hearing, Lizzie's family addressed Mazzaglia through tears, describing the pain he had inflicted. Mazzaglia, given a chance to speak, still insisted he hadn't done anything to Lizzie and apologized only for hiding her death. The judge, unmoved by his denial, officially imposed the life term, though ultimately this was a mandatory sentence. Mazzaglia remains in prison for life, but Kat McDonough was released in 2016 after serving her sentence. Some felt her punishment was too light given her role in the crime. However, Lizzie's own parents have expressed some degree of compassion toward Kat, believing that Seth's manipulation heavily influenced her actions. Notably, while awaiting trial, Mazzaglia even tried to orchestrate a brazen escape from jail, a scheme that was foiled and brought additional charges against him. Sadly, Lizzie Marriott's body was never recovered from the water. In lieu of a grave, her family created a memorial bench near a quiet lake in the Massachusetts woods to remember her. In my own view, Kat McDonough's sentence feels far too light, and I realize that this might be somewhat controversial, so let me explain it further. I don't dismiss the reality of the control Seth Mazzaglia had over her. Coercive, manipulative relationships can twist a person's world until they can't see straight. But even with all that, she still had choices. She still had moments where she could have stopped everything from unfolding the way it did. She could have warned Lizzie not to come over that night. She could have stepped outside and called the police. She could have reached out to anyone in her life and said something wasn't right. Instead, she helped lure Lizzie into that apartment, stayed silent during the attack, and then participated in the cleanup afterward. There were a lot of off-ramps where she could have saved Lizzie's life, or at the very least made sure her body was recovered. Her testimony was important, and I get why prosecutors needed it, but that doesn't erase her actions. Without her testimony, convicting Seth would have been much more difficult without a body. But cooperation after the fact doesn't undo the damage done in the moment when Lizzie needed someone to stand up for her. And knowing she served such a short sentence, walked out of prison, and got to restart her life while Lizzie's family never got their daughter back, that's something I just can't square. It feels like accountability never matched the gravity of what she allowed to happen. 16-year-old Joyce McLean was the kind of teenager who made her small town of East Millinocket, Maine, very proud. She was bright and talented. She was a popular cheerleader, honor student, and band member at Schenck High School. Joyce had displayed extraordinary musical ability from an early age, and even enjoyed composing her own songs. She had just earned her driver's license and was excitedly planning a beach party for her 17th birthday. To paraphrase what her mother Pam later said, Joyce was very excited to be heading into a new phase of her life. Unfortunately, this bright new phase of her life would never be Joyce's reality. On the warm evening of August 8, 1980, Joyce set out for a routine jog to get in shape for the upcoming soccer season. She left home around 7:30 p.m., running toward the fields behind her high school, and was seen heading into the twilight near the school grounds. This would be the last known sighting of her alive. When she failed to return home, her mother grew worried and drove around looking for her, but Joyce had vanished. Her mother quickly alerted police, and for 2 days and nights, family and friends combed the community for any trace of the missing teen. Then, on Sunday morning, August 10th, 1980, a volunteer searcher discovered a horror no one in East Millinocket ever expected. Joyce's lifeless body was found in the woods along a power line clearing behind Schenck High School's athletic fields. Her skull was crushed by a heavy blow, her hands were tied behind her back with a piece of cloth, and there were marks suggesting she had been strangled with an object. Her clothing was in disarray, but investigators determined she had not been subject to an indecent assault. The idyllic peace of East Millinocket was shattered by the grim discovery. In a town where doors were usually left unlocked, residents now found themselves afraid, wondering who could have done such a thing in their midst. Pam McLean publicly pleaded for anyone with information to come forward, vowing that neither she nor the perpetrator would ever know peace until he was caught. And yeah, spoiler alert, Pam was going to make good on this promise. The initial police investigation faced daunting hurdles. Detectives determined that Joyce had likely been slain the same night she went missing, but beyond that, hard evidence was scarce. One person did emerge early on as a potential suspect, 19-year-old Scott Fournier. In the pre-dawn hours after Joyce disappeared, Fournier had stolen a fuel truck from a local garage and crashed it a short distance from the school, suffering a serious head injury. He was in a coma for weeks afterward, and when questioned, Fournier initially claimed to remember nothing about that night. But in May 1981, he gave a statement to police that sounded like a confession, saying he might have beat Joyce while he was in a drunken haze. A few days later, he recanted that story, insisting he had only had a bad dream, and given the magnitude of his brain injury, this seemed plausible. Over the ensuing years, Fournier made several troubling remarks about the crime. He allegedly confessed to a pastor and separately to his own parents in the 1980s, and later even told a coworker that he was responsible for Joyce's demise. In these retellings, he sometimes implicated other men, but investigators eventually ruled out all the people he named. Notably, Fournier knew details about the crime scene that had never been made public. For example, he described how Joyce's hands were tied behind her back. Still, without any physical evidence or a consistent, credible confession, police didn't charge Fournier or anyone else, and by the mid-80s, Joyce McLean's case went cold. For the next 30-plus years, Joyce's family and neighbors kept her memory alive and the quest for justice ongoing. Pam McLean refused to let the authorities forget her daughter's case. She and the community formed a Justice for Joyce committee and held candlelight vigils on anniversaries associated with Joyce and the investigation. In 2008, nearly 28 years after the slaying, Pam's perseverance led to a dramatic turn. That year, with community fundraising support, Joyce's body was exhumed for a fresh forensic examination. Forensic specialists Doctors Michael Baden and Henry Lee conducted a new autopsy and announced that they had found physical evidence that gave investigators renewed hope. They didn't publicly disclose what the new evidence was, but it was the most significant break in the case in decades. Ultimately, it's unclear what this evidence was, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. At any rate, it's safe to assume that this evidence wasn't the potential bombshell it was thought to be. That said, sometimes causation has a funny way of working things out, and without this apparent dead-end path, Fournier likely would have gotten away with it. Following the exhumation, Maine State Police reopened the McLean investigation. Detectives in 2008 began re-interviewing witnesses and reviewing the case from scratch. In 2009, authorities publicly confirmed that Scott Fournier, long quietly suspected, was a person of interest in Joyce's slaying. As the cold case squad dug in, new witnesses emerged to bolster the case. One former colleague of Fournier's came forward with a story. Back in 1989, Fournier had suddenly blurted out a confession to him at work. Tips like these, combined with the forensic re-examination, strengthened the circumstantial case against Fournier piece by piece. After years of painstaking work, investigators and prosecutors concluded they finally had enough to secure a conviction. On March 4, 2016, nearly 36 years after the event, Maine State Police arrested 55-year-old Fournier and charged him. Fournier went on trial in January 2018, and he waived his right to a jury, leaving the verdict up to a judge. This was apparently a strategic move by his defense counsel in light of Fournier's multiple confessions over the course of the years. They had believed that a judge would be more likely to accept evidence that Fournier's statements were the result of a traumatic brain injury rather than any real commission of a crime. Given that this is a video on solved cases rather than unsolved mysteries, I'm sure I don't have to telegraph to you any further how well this strategy ultimately worked out. Because forensic evidence linking him to the crime was virtually non-existent, the prosecution's case focused on Fournier's own words and knowledge. They presented testimony about his multiple confessions over the years, and the specific details he knew about the crime scene that only the perpetrator would know. The defense argued that Fournier's so-called admissions were the unreliable ramblings of a man who had suffered a brain-damaging head injury on the night in question. His lawyers suggested that his memories were confused or imagined, and they pointed to other possible culprits. After hearing 2 weeks of evidence, Superior Court Justice Anne Murray rendered her verdict on February 22, 2018. She found Scott Fournier guilty in Joyce McLean's case, finally closing a chapter that had haunted the community for nearly 38 years. Justice Murray sentenced him to 45 years in prison, and in 2019, Maine's highest court upheld Fournier's conviction, ensuring that he remained behind bars. Ultimately, the slogan, "Justice for Joyce," was fulfilled, and this cold case was solved after a decades-long fight for truth and accountability. It's March 1993. More than a year has passed since anyone has seen Kimberly Pandelios. Hikers are moving through a remote, rugged section of the Angeles National Forest, far from any marked trail. They're near an isolated wooded area known as the Cement Slab, which includes a small creek bed, not far from the Monte Cristo campground. There, they find it. Not a complete body, not anymore. They find a human skull and a pelvic bone. This grim discovery is the first real break in a case that had been frozen solid for 12 months. Kimberly Pandelios, a 21-year-old aspiring model, had vanished on February 27, 1992. Her disappearance was a complete mystery until this moment. When forensic teams arrive at the cement slab, the scene tells a story of terrifying brutality. Scattered near the skull, they find a pair of handcuffs, Kimberly's ring and earrings, and her fractured mandible, or jawbone. They also recover a bra and pantyhose. Both garments had been severed by a sharp object, like a knife or razor. This fragmented discovery in the wilderness was the first halting step in solving a slaying that would ultimately take another 12 years to close. To understand the scene in the forest, we have to rewind to February 27, 1992. Kimberly Pandelios was 21, ambitious, and trying to build a career as a model. She saw a modeling recruitment advertisement and answered it, believing she was scheduling a meeting with a professional magazine photographer. That day, she was seen dressed for what she thought was a job interview: a blue suit, a white blouse, and high heels. But the advertisement was a lie. The quote-unquote photographer was David Raidmaker, 28 years old at the time. The entire photo shoot was a predatory ruse to assault young women. Kimberly drove her car to meet him around 1 p.m. at a secluded location on the Angeles Crest Highway near the border of the National Forest. When they met, Raidmaker made his overture. Kimberly rebuffed him, but he didn't take no for an answer. He overpowered her, committed disgusting acts against her, and then pushed her head into a nearby creek. He held her there until she drowned. Her ambition had been expertly used against her, a specific lure to draw in a young woman willing to take a professional risk, leading her instead into a deadly trap. The slaying was just the beginning of Raidmaker's work that day. Later that same evening, a Los Angeles deputy sheriff on patrol noticed Kimberly's car. It was parked on the shoulder of the Angeles Crest Highway, just north of the Monte Cristo campground. The deputy noted it appeared vacant and in good condition and drove on. But Raidmaker wasn't done with it. He returned to the vehicle, and this time, he brought an audience. With him was a different kind of victim, a 14-year-old girl whom he had groomed. She was unaware of the slaying and watched as Raidmaker squirted charcoal lighter fluid inside the car's cabin and set it on fire. At some point during the blaze, Raidmaker informed her of what he had done, trying to instill fear into this living victim. The deputy later returned and witnessed the vehicle on fire, astutely observing it came from the front passenger side and not the engine department. He believed this was a clear indication of arson intended to destroy evidence. Raidmaker's decision to bring the 14-year-old was a profound miscalculation on his part. He was trying to bind her to him through fear and a shared secret, implicating her in a major felony. Instead, he had just created the only living witness who could place him at the scene of the cover-up. In his haste, he also left a trail. Near the burned-out car, police recovered the tools of the arson: an empty charcoal lighter fluid container, a plastic lighter, and one other tiny crucial item: a single handcuff key. The discovery of the burned car and the handcuff key in February 1992 was a start, but it led nowhere. There was no victim, so there was no case. The investigation went cold almost immediately. It was hikers, not police, who found the rest of the evidence, piece by piece, over the next 3 years. A month after Kimberly vanished, hikers found her appointment book at the bottom of a bridge near a creek. Then, a full year later, in March 1993, came the grim discovery of her skull and pelvic bone at the cement slab. This find triggered the full forensic recovery, which uncovered the fractured jawbone, her jewelry, and the severed clothing. Most importantly, that team found the other half of the puzzle, a pair of handcuffs. This was the moment the two crime scenes were forensically linked. A key found at the car fire and handcuffs found with the body. The evidence, though separated by a year and a mile, told a clear story. The perpetrator bound his victim, slew her, and then torched her car, accidentally dropping the key in the process. The forest had given up its secrets, but the case still had no suspect. For 12 years, that's where it stayed. The case was a collection of grim, disconnected facts. Then, in January 2004, the matter finally broke open. It happened because of a bizarre convergence of events. A cold case unit decided to reinvestigate Kimberly's disappearance. This happened, coincidentally, right after David Raidmaker was released from prison for a string of unrelated crimes. His freedom is what made the case solvable. For 12 years, the prime suspect had been off the streets, and his release put him back on the radar. The police got incredibly lucky, and they learned that Raidmaker, a systemic predator, had confessed. During an illicit relationship with another 14-year-old girl, Raidmaker had driven her to the Angeles forest. He'd bragged to her, confessing that he had slain a pretty blonde model that he lured there through the classifieds. But that wasn't why he was so proud of what he had done. He told her that he was famous. His handiwork had been featured on the show Unsolved Mysteries, and that tens of millions of people had heard about his crime. However, according to her, he was extremely upset that the show had said that the likely suspects were outlaw bikers. When she told the cops, they were able to obtain the old footage and saw that this biker theory was in the episode. Raidmaker's extreme arrogance had just provided the external validation for his own secret confession. Armed with this story, investigators knew exactly who to talk to. They found the 14-year-old girl who had watched Raidmaker burn Kimberly's car 12 years earlier. Disturbingly, according to court records, her name had been in the case file in relation to the car arson investigation, and she had been recorded as Raidmaker's girlfriend. This was despite the fact that she was 14 years old and he was an adult. Now an adult in her mid-20s, she agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. It was an incredibly brave act, forcing her to re-engage with the man who had controlled her. The police outfitted her with a wire and staged a surveillance operation. During these recorded conversations, Raidmaker's past tactics were turned against him. She used the quote-unquote trust he had built through grooming to get him to talk about that night in 1992. And he did. Raidmaker was recorded admitting that he had set fire to the car, but he wasn't willing to go so far as to admit to the crime. But it didn't matter. That was it. It was the final nail. It corroborated the 1992 deputy's arson report. It linked him to the car, which, via the handcuff key, linked him to the body. It was all confirmed by his own bragging confession to the other girl, and police arrested David Raidmaker during the surveillance process. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury heard how Raidmaker had lured, abducted, and drowned Kimberly Pandelios, and they convicted him. Raidmaker's legal battles, however, continued for another decade. His appeals went all the way to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal. Notably, he didn't argue his innocence in the slaying. Instead, they focused on a technicality, an erroneous jury instruction regarding the element of asportation. Asportation is the legal term for the moving away of the victim, a necessary proof for kidnapping. The judge appears to have tipped his hand about his belief in the jury instruction regarding this portion of the crime. The defense argued this flawed instruction meant the finding of guilt was invalid. In essence, The defense said that the case ought to be overturned and sent back for a new trial on the basis of this flawed instruction. This wouldn't mean he was found not guilty, but rather that a new trial would have to be held on the basis of the improper instructions. The defense was, of course, banking on the fact that witnesses wouldn't want to go through the process again, or perhaps they couldn't. For instance, if a key witness was no longer alive, that would make convicting him again very difficult. Ultimately, the result of this argument was shocking, at least to a certain degree. The courts listened and ultimately agreed the instruction was flawed, but they also found that it didn't matter. They ruled that it was a harmless error and that the objective evidence for the actual crime was so overwhelming that the jury's findings stood. All out of appeals, David Rademacher will remain behind bars for the rest of his life for the tragic 1992 slaying of Kimberly Pandelios. Picture the silence in the Aldridge family home, heavy and suffocating. It's the first day of July 1979, and 20-year-old Tammy Sue Aldridge is gone. She went for a jog the day before and never returned. Then, the phone rings, shattering the quiet. It's her. She's alive. Her family hears her voice. But this isn't a rescue. She calls again the next night, Monday, July 2nd. She was, according to the investigation, allowed to make these calls by her captor. Her captor is demonstrating his power, forcing her and her family to participate in a 3-day nightmare. Those 2 calls were the last time her family would ever hear from her. The next time she was found, it would be in a way that would haunt Alamance County for decades. Tammy Sue was a young woman with a clear and compassionate future. She was 20 years old, a college student at East Carolina University, and she knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life. At a press conference 45 years later, her family, still grieving, shared her specific ambition. She was studying to become a physical therapist. Her dream was to work with the elderly, helping them recover from injuries sustained in falls. This was the person who, on Saturday, June 30th, 1979, laced up her shoes for a routine jog near Jim Barnwell Road in northern Alamance County. She was a person whose entire identity was built around care, on a path to a life of service. But on that summer day, she crossed paths with someone whose intentions were the exact opposite, and her bright future was stolen. The agonizing, hope-filled wait and the 2 phone calls came to a brutal end in the early morning hours of July 3rd, 1979. Tammy's body was discovered. The way she was left speaks volumes about the perpetrator's disturbed mindset. She wasn't hidden in the woods or buried in a shallow grave. She was dumped in the middle of Highway 54, near the intersection with another well-trafficked road. It was a public, brazen, and depersonalized act, a way of discarding a person as if they were nothing. But the crime itself was horrifically personal. The evidence at the scene told a story of complete control and violence. Her ankles were bound. The medical examiner's report was grim, confirming she had been indecently assaulted. The official cause was strangulation. In the midst of this 1979 horror, investigators did one thing right, one thing that would prove more important than any other piece of the case. They collected and preserved the male biological evidence from Tammy's body. This sample would become the case's silent, unimpeachable witness, patiently waiting 45 years for science to give it a voice. The pressure to find the person responsible for such a shocking crime was immense, but the initial investigation would only lead to more pain for the Aldridge family. Authorities did identify a suspect in the months following the slaying. The Aldridge family had to steel themselves, believing justice was finally at hand, and endure a full criminal trial. They had to watch as the man they believed ended their daughter sat in a courtroom. And then, the system failed them. The case collapsed. The man was found not guilty and acquitted. This legal failure was a second devastating blow. The case was now poisoned, and for all practical purposes, it went cold. While the system was focused on the wrong man, the real perp was living just miles away, hiding in plain sight. His name, we now know, was Gary Laframboise. In 1979, he was 19 years old and lived in Graham, North Carolina. His residence was just 4 miles from where Tammy's body was found, placing him squarely in the geographic profile of a likely suspect. And here's the most shocking part of the entire 45-year mystery, the near miss that is almost too painful to contemplate. The police had him. Just 3 months after Tammy was slain, while the investigation was still active, Laframboise was arrested. He was charged with kidnapping and, in a detail that would echo throughout the subsequent investigation, impersonating a police officer. One can only imagine how a predator might use that authority to stop a young woman jogging on a rural road. While in custody for those charges, Laframboise proved his capacity for extreme violence by breaking the skull of a prison guard. Somehow, despite his extreme portfolio of known offenses, and despite being found guilty of everything, he only served time from 1980 to 1982. In retrospect, the connections are quite staggering. A local 19-year-old living nearby, arrested for kidnapping, who uses a police impersonation ruse and is pathologically violent. Yet no one in 1979 connected his file to Tammy's. The system had the perpetrator, and they didn't know it. After the acquittal, Tammy's case file was effectively sealed and buried. It became one of Alamance County's most infamous and painful cold cases, a debacle that haunted the community and the investigators who had worked it. For decades, there was nothing but silence. The case remained frozen in time until 2002, when a new sheriff, Terry Johnson, took office. Johnson made it a personal and professional priority to apply new resources to these old, forgotten cases. He and his team began the painstaking process of rebuilding the Aldridge investigation from scratch. The task was made even more difficult by decades of institutional neglect. They found that crucial files and records from the original 1979 investigation had, at some point, been disposed of by the police department, despite the fact that it wasn't closed. The key to solving the case wasn't in the lost police reports. It was locked away in an evidence box, waiting. One intrepid detective managed to locate a box full of that male biological sample. And this is where science bridged the 45-year gap. Forensic technicians, using technology that was science fiction in 1979, were able to develop a complete profile from that tiny, degraded sample. But this wasn't an easy win. The perp's DNA wasn't in the federal database. The breakthrough came from a revolutionary new field that I may have mentioned once or twice before: forensic genetic genealogy. They submitted the profile to genealogical databases and found a partial match, not to Laframboise, but to his relatives. By painstakingly building a family tree from that match, investigators were led to a DNA sample from Laframboise's own daughter. In April 2024, nearly 45 years after Tammy's death, the Alamance County Sheriff's Office held an emotional press conference. They announced to the world that the case was solved. Sheriff Terry Johnson, visibly moved, described it as a day of mixed emotions. It was a sad day, he explained, because it had taken 45 years to provide an answer, and sad because it forced the Aldridge family to relive the loss all over again. But it was a glad day because they could finally, definitively, name the man responsible. But the resolution came with one final bitter twist. There would be no trial. Gary Laframboise, the man who evaded justice for the 1979 slaying, would never face a jury. He had died in South Carolina in 2020. Notably, the only photograph of him I was able to find depicts the predator as a much younger man. Justice, in the end, was incomplete. The Ulrich family received an answer, but they were denied accountability. At the 2024 press conference, the sheriff's office made a critical and chilling statement that they, quote, can't confirm if he acted alone. This is a massive, haunting question. Think back to the crime. A 3-day captivity. The victim kept alive. Those two allowed phone calls. The police clearly have suspicions that this wasn't just the work of a 19-year-old lone wolf. The 45-year search for justice for Tammy Sue Aldridge has closed one chapter, only to open another, filled with new and perhaps unanswerable questions. When 19-year-old Lindy Sue Beckler's aunt and uncle arrived at her apartment on the night of December 5th, 1975, they expected to exchange recipes and keep her company. This was a comforting routine born from Lindy's recent fears that someone was watching her in her Manor Township home in Pennsylvania. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. Blood stained the front door, the entryway wall, and the carpet inside. Lindy's body lay on the floor near the living room, showing signs of the brutal attack. She had been stabbed numerous times, and the weapon was left at the scene. Horrifically, the knife was from Lindy's own kitchen, suggesting the perpetrator grabbed it at the scene. Later, forensic analysis showed that a second knife had also been used and taken away by the attacker. Investigators recovered critical forensic clues: the attacker's biological material on Lindy's underwear and 2 small drops of blood on her stockings. These clues would eventually be the key to cracking the case decades later using genetic genealogy. Lindy's new husband, Phil, was quickly ruled out as a suspect, and within weeks, police had interviewed about 300 people in the area without any luck. Despite the bloodshed, the perpetrator had left behind no obvious fingerprints or identification. Investigators noted a footprint in the kitchen believed to be the perpetrator's, but this led to nothing at the time. They also sought information on a dark-colored car seen double-parked outside the apartment around the time of the attack, but this lead also fizzled out. As the weeks turned into months, the case that shocked Lancaster County threatened to go cold. Determined to find justice, authorities chased every tip and potential lead. In early 1976, just 1 month after Lindy's slaying, police caught a dangerous suspect in another case. This was Mark Capiloupo, an 18-year-old arrested for a string of violent attacks on local women. The young man had assaulted several women around the same time as Lindy's slaying, fueling hope that he might also be responsible for Lindy's death. Investigators noted similarities in the violence and eagerly interrogated Capiloupo, but after careful scrutiny, he was cleared of involvement in the attack. It was a devastating disappointment for detectives in the community, and many thought the cops had dropped the ball. Capiloupo was jailed for his other crimes, and would end up being pumped full of lead during a prison escape attempt a year later, ending his reign of terror. Some thought this was a fitting end for the person responsible for Lindy's death, but it turned out the real perp was still at large, and would be for decades. As the first anniversary of Lindy's death approached, the case took an unsettling turn. In December 1976, visitors to Lindy's grave discovered that her headstone had been vandalized. It was doused in red paint and slashed with something sharp. Whether it was a cruel prank or the perpetrator returning to relive the crime, police couldn't be sure. Then, only weeks after the gravestone incident, a chilling letter arrived in the mail for Lancaster's police chief. The letter claimed to be from the perpetrator, taunting the chief for failing to catch him. In disturbing detail, the letter's author referenced specifics of the crime scene not known to the public. He bragged that the red paint and nicks on Lindy's gravestone represented each wound he had inflicted. The letter provided further weird details. He described himself as a chubby man who had done it while under the influence of substances. Bizarrely, the letter ended with someone signing the name Janice Crum, claiming to be a friend, finishing the message and begging for help for him. Needless to say, the investigators were stunned. The letter contained details about the slaying and grave defacement that had never been publicized, so the cops thought it was likely from the attacker. That said, they had some doubts, though. The writer hinted he might confess if the letter was printed in the newspaper, but authorities agonized over how to respond. In the end, police decided not to publish the rambling note, wary of giving him notoriety or playing into a possible hoax. After all, the writer may have simply made lucky guesses that matched the crime, or details of the investigation could have leaked through one of the 300 interviews. They tried to trace the letter's origin and the mysterious Janice Crum, but hit a dead end, and no such person could be found. Notably, whether this letter was a bizarre confession or simply a hoax would remain an unsolved mystery forever. Over the years, investigators periodically revisited the evidence with fresh eyes. As early as 1997, DNA technology offered a glimmer of hope. Technicians were able to extract a male DNA profile from the preserved biological material. In 2000, that DNA profile was uploaded into the FBI's database of convicted offenders, but no match was found. The unknown subject had no prior record that would link him to the crime. The case stagnated once more, but crucially, the DNA evidence was safely stored. Investigators understood that forensic science was advancing rapidly, and that one day, a new technique might crack the mystery that traditional detective work could not. In 2019, the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office formed a dedicated cold case unit, and Lindy Sue Beckler's file was at the top of the pile. They reached out to a Virginia-based genetics company, Parabon Nanolabs, to apply cutting-edge DNA analysis to the old evidence. Parabon's forensic experts first used DNA phenotyping to generate composite images of what Lindy's attacker might have looked like. From the crime scene DNA, they predicted the suspect's physical characteristics, then created two sketches, one reflecting a man about 25 years and another of a man around 65. The phenotyping suggested a light-skinned white male with hazel eyes and dark hair. These composite sketches were released to the public in 2019, briefly reigniting interest in the case. But while the images put a hypothetical face to the perpetrator, they still didn't provide a name. For that, investigators would need to dig deeper into the suspect's lineage. By late 2020, the team enlisted a renowned genetic genealogist, Cece Moore, working with Parabon to build the perpetrator's family tree. From the strands of family connection, Moore painstakingly constructed ancestral lines, zeroing in on one family in particular. The DNA pointed to roots in a small town in southern Italy, and this clue proved pivotal. In fact, Moore's research suggested that whoever attacked Lindy Sue Beckler had ancestors from Gasparina, Italy, an unusual detail that dramatically narrowed the field of suspects. Cross-referencing this specific Italian heritage with local records, Moore and her team identified a single name that fit all the data points. This was David Sinopoli, a man of Italian descent who had lived in Lancaster at the time. Investigators were stunned by the lead. David Sinopoli was a now 68-year-old resident of Lancaster County who had never been on their radar. Decades earlier, however, he had lived in the very same 4-unit apartment building as Lindy Sue Beckler. In fact, he was a neighbor of Lindy's in 1974, a year before the slaying, but had since moved out. He had no obvious connection to Lindy on record beyond being a former neighbor, and no serious criminal history. But now, thanks to genetic genealogy, he was the prime suspect. Investigators knew they needed direct evidence to conclusively tie him to the crime, namely, a fresh sample of his DNA to compare with the crime scene profile. In February 2022, a surveillance team quietly tailed David Sinopoli as he traveled through Philadelphia International Airport. They watched as he sat in a terminal coffee shop with his wife, casually chatting before a flight, and noted when he finished his coffee and tossed the cup into a trash bin. The moment Sinopoli walked away, investigators swooped in and retrieved the discarded cup. At long last, they had it. A covert sample of Sinopoli's DNA. Back in the lab, forensic analysts compared DNA from the coffee cup against the old biological sample from Lindy's body, and it was a direct match. In fact, the probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Sinopoli was astronomically low, on the order of 1 in 10 trillion. On July 17, 2022, police moved in and arrested David Sinopoli at his Lancaster home. The 68-year-old was taken into custody without incident, ending one of Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Sinopoli had been an unremarkable presence in Lancaster for years. He was a well-liked married father who worked at a printing company and indulged a passion for hunting and trips to see Italy. Few could have imagined that this ordinary-seeming neighbor was harboring such a dark secret. After his arrest, prosecutors noted that a motive for Lindy's slaying remained unclear and likely lost to time. With DNA evidence as the undeniable witness, the legal case against Sinopoli was strong. Rather than face a trial, Sinopoli ultimately chose to plead guilty. In October 2023, nearly 48 years after Lindy Sue Beckler was slain, a 69-year-old Sinopoli stood in a Lancaster County courtroom and admitted to the offense. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison, which, given his age, is effectively a life sentence. In the courtroom, Lindy's family confronted the perpetrator at last, displaying a photo of Lindy and speaking of the lifetime of pain he caused. Though Sinopoli offered a feeble apology, the judge bluntly noted that he showed remorse only because he was caught. For nearly a decade, the fate of 19-year-old aspiring model Kara Nichols remained a haunting mystery. In October 2012, she vanished during a trip from Colorado Springs to Denver for a modeling job, and her family endured years of uncertainty, clinging to hope while fearing the worst. The investigation into Kara's disappearance spanned multiple law enforcement teams and countless leads, ultimately culminating in a shocking discovery that finally revealed the truth. This is the story of what happened to Kara, how the case was solved, and the relentless pursuit of justice that brought answers to light. On October 9, 2012, Kara Nichols left her home in El Paso County, Colorado, telling friends she was heading to Denver for a photo shoot. For her, this represented a potential break for her budding modeling career. Denver's larger modeling scene promised more opportunities for the ambitious 19-year-old. Kara spent part of that day with another young woman and stayed active on social media until that evening, when all communication from her abruptly ceased. When she failed to return home or answer her phone, her family grew alarmed. Kara even left behind her purse and other personal belongings, suggesting she intended to come back shortly. Her father soon reported her missing, and police immediately suspected foul play. Investigators worried that Kara's modeling aspirations might have led her into a trap set by predators posing as talent scouts. The search for Kara kicked off with flyers, pleas on social media, and community volunteer efforts, but authorities focused on concrete clues. One early lead pointed to a local man named Joel Hollendorfer, the person Kara had been on the phone with shortly before she vanished. Hollendorfer admitted he planned to meet Kara that night, but he denied any knowledge of her disappearance. Detectives also learned that 2 women had been seen with Kara on the day she went missing, and they were sought as potential witnesses who might shed light on her last hours. Despite these leads and many tips over the ensuing months, the trail ultimately went cold. Some feared she had been ensnared by an underground network that exploits young models for illicit work. This was a chilling theory that couldn't be proven without evidence, but it seemed unfortunately plausible. Over the next several years, investigators chased every lead they could. The case eventually consumed thousands of hours of investigative work, dozens of search warrants, and inquiries that stretched across the United States and even Europe. But ultimately, the truth in Kara's case wasn't to be found on some faraway shore. The truth lay much closer to home. In 2014, investigators brought cadaver dogs to the Hollendorfer family's rural property after cell phone data pointed them there. The dogs alerted to a specific spot, but Joel's mother explained that a horse was buried in that exact place, so no excavation was done. It was a devastating close call. Unknown to the search team at the time, Kara's grave was likely just a few feet away, concealed beneath that horse's remains. And just to be clear, there was a horse buried there, but as it would turn out, this horse corpse was a clever ruse by a sick individual with little regard for any form of life. It wasn't until early 2022 that the case finally saw a breakthrough. In February of that year, a re-examination of the cold case led investigators to an unexpected witness with crucial information. This witness was Joel Hollendorfer's ex-wife, and she came forward to reveal that around 2014, Joel had privately confessed. She said that he admitted to causing a young woman's death and hiding the body on his parents' property. According to her, Joel claimed he had hired Kara as an escort and accidentally strangled her, then buried her in an old horse grave on the family farm. Armed with this tip, authorities quietly arrested Hollendorfer on an unrelated charge to keep him in custody while they prepared a new search of the property. When investigators returned to the farm, they immediately zeroed in on the same area that had raised suspicion in 2014. Hollendorfer continued to insist that nothing unusual was buried there, but when agents cross-checked with his mother, she confirmed that was indeed the horse grave. With probable cause bolstered by the ex-wife's testimony and the contradictory statements, detectives obtained a warrant and began to dig on February 3, 2022. About 3 feet beneath the surface, they found black plastic bags sealed with duct tape, containing human remains. Within days, forensic tests confirmed the heartbreaking truth. The remains were those of Kara Nichols. After nearly 10 years, the mystery of Kara's disappearance had finally been solved, and Joel Hollendorfer was promptly charged in connection with her death. With Kara's body finally recovered, prosecutors moved swiftly to hold Hollendorfer accountable. He was charged with first-degree slaying and tampering with evidence. The coroner's autopsy report confirmed that Kara's cause of death was asphyxia due to strangulation, a finding that matched the scenario described by the ex-wife's account. In mid-2023, the case went to trial. A jury ultimately found Hollendorfer guilty of causing her unlawful death, not the top charge that authorities originally sought. Hollendorfer's private confession had laid the groundwork for his defense, and his team stuck to that story. In essence, the prosecution was unable to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had willfully caused her demise. In August 2023, he was sentenced to 24 years in prison. the maximum allowed for the offense. Kara's family was dismayed by what they saw as a lenient outcome. They felt that the lesser conviction and 24-year sentence didn't adequately reflect the severity of the crime or the value of Kara's life. Still, her loved ones found some solace in knowing the truth and seeing Hollendorfer behind bars. 15-year-old Sierra Lamar left her home in Morgan Hill, California, to catch the school bus early on March 16, 2012. She never made it to class that day, and by nightfall, an ordinary spring morning had transformed into every parent's worst nightmare. The bright-spirited cheerleader had seemingly vanished without a trace. Sierra's disappearance set off a massive search effort and a years-long quest for justice that gripped her community. It would take a combination of dogged persistence and cutting-edge DNA forensics to unravel what happened to Sierra. Sierra's mother only realized something was wrong when the school called to report that Sierra never arrived at class, a notice that came only after the school day ended. This delay later prompted the school district to change its policy and notify parents of absences much earlier. Disturbingly, by the time Sierra was reported missing that afternoon, significant valuable hours were already lost. News of the mysterious disappearance spread quickly. Sierra's case made national headlines, and thousands of volunteers from Morgan Hill and beyond joined the effort to find the missing 15-year-old. Search teams scoured rural areas, combing through fields on foot, and even diving into local reservoirs for any sign of her. Within days, investigators uncovered several crucial clues. Sierra's smartphone was found discarded on the roadside the day after she went missing, not far from her route to the bus stop. Like most people, Sierra was rarely without her phone, so this discovery was an immediate red flag to investigators. Further, her purse was discovered a few miles from home, containing her neatly folded shirt, pants, and undergarments. Finding these personal items abandoned strongly suggested foul play, since it was highly unlikely that she would have dumped her own purse even if she left voluntarily. But perhaps most disturbingly of all, forensic tests on Sierra's clothing revealed an unknown male genetic profile lifted from a biological sample. Investigators also noted that tracking dogs lost Sierra's scent at the end of her driveway, as if she'd been picked up by a vehicle near her home. These early clues left little doubt that Sierra had been abducted. The priority now was to figure out who was responsible. The unknown DNA from Sierra's clothing turned out to be the key. When the profile was run through a criminal database, it matched 21-year-old Antolin Garcia Torres. He was a local Safeway employee whose DNA had been collected in a prior felony assault case. This young father-to-be had no known connection to Sierra, which made the DNA hit all the more surprising. When he was interviewed, he denied all connection to her, and the police played along. By late March 2012, detectives quietly placed Garcia under 24-hour surveillance, hoping he might lead them to Sierra or reveal further evidence. They soon learned that a red Volkswagen Jetta had been spotted in Sierra's neighborhood on the morning she vanished, and Garcia happened to own that same type of car. On April 7th, the cops dropped the facade that they had given up on him as a suspect and seized his Jetta for examination and conducted a search of his home. Security camera footage showed Garcia driving off in his Jetta about 15 minutes before Sierra headed for her bus stop that morning. In addition, forensic analysts found traces of Sierra's presence in the car. Her DNA turned up on an interior door handle, and a strand of her hair was discovered in the trunk. This was, of course, quite odd, given that, according to Garcia, he had no knowledge of her. On May 21, 2012, over 2 months after Sierra disappeared, authorities decided to act. Santa Clara County deputies arrested Garcia at the Morgan Hill Safeway where he worked. Fearing he might harm someone else if left on the streets, police charged him with Sierra's kidnapping. During the course of the investigation, it was also discovered that he had attempted to kidnap 3 other women in 2009, and he was charged with those offenses as well. At a news conference following the arrest, Sierra's mother Marlene pleaded with the suspect to reveal anything he knew, begging him to tell them where her daughter was. Investigators, meanwhile, characterized the crime as a random stranger abduction. They voiced confidence that they had enough hard evidence to prosecute Garcia even without finding Sierra herself. Garcia pleaded not guilty, and the case took years to wind through the legal system. A grand jury indictment in 2014 finally pushed the stalled case toward trial, and prosecutors announced they would seek the Big DP given the circumstances. Sierra's family and volunteers continued organizing searches, but by 2015, 3 years after she vanished, they had exhausted all leads and held their last organized search for her. The trial began in early 2017, 5 years after Sierra's disappearance. Over several months, jurors heard extensive testimony and evidence. Because Sierra's body was still missing, prosecutors faced the challenge of proving she had been slain without a body as evidence. Prosecutors presented the forensic links tying Garcia to the crime, including the DNA on Sierra's discarded clothing and the strands of her hair in his trunk. This was juxtaposed with the statements he had given where he stated that he had never met her and had no knowledge of her. Further, the location where the hair was found, in the trunk, further supported the idea that this was a violent stranger abduction case with fatal consequences. To bolster their case, they also introduced evidence of Garcia's past attacks on women. The jury learned that in 2009, multiple women had been accosted in Safeway parking lots around Morgan Hill. In one incident, a victim fought off a man who tried to subdue her with a taser. The attacker fled, but a fingerprint on that weapon later matched Garcia. This pattern of prior attempted abductions painted him as a predator who had escalated to targeting Sierra. The defense, in contrast, claimed the evidence was circumstantial. Garcia's attorneys suggested the DNA findings could have resulted from lab contamination rather than anything else. They emphasized that without a body, no one could be absolutely certain what happened to Sierra. They even implied that she might still be alive and could have left home willingly. Despite these arguments, the circumstantial evidence and DNA were persuasive. In May 2017, the jury returned a verdict finding Garcia guilty on all counts. He was convicted of abducting and slaying Sierra Lamar, as well as the attempted kidnappings of the 3 other women from the Safeway incidents. It was an unusual case in that no body had been recovered, yet the evidence of foul play was strong enough to secure a conviction. During a separate penalty phase, the jury had to decide between giving him the DP and life in prison, and in the end, they chose to spare him. In June 2017, they recommended a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, which the judge formally imposed soon after. At the sentencing, Sierra's family addressed the court with emotional impact statements. They directly implored Garcia to tell them what he did with Sierra and where to find her remains. Sierra's father asked the convicted man how he would feel if one of his own daughters were the victim. Garcia offered no response, providing no information that could give the family the closure they desperately sought. Years later, Sierra Lamar's fate remains a painful mystery for her loved ones. Garcia continues to insist he is innocent, even writing a letter to a reporter proclaiming he didn't harm Sierra. To this day, he has never revealed any new details. Tragically, Sierra's body has never been found, leaving her family without the closure of a proper goodbye. Wildwood, New Jersey was packed with holiday revelers on Memorial Day weekend in 1990, including 20-year-old college student Susan Nagersmith from Carmel, New York. Then tragedy struck when Susan's body was found behind a local restaurant the very next day. She was partially clothed and clearly the victim of a violent attack. To her family's shock and outrage, authorities initially declared her death an accident, despite obvious signs of foul play. It would take over 3 decades and major advances in DNA technology to finally uncover the truth of what happened to Susan that night. Disturbingly, though, that truth would turn out to be a very cold comfort. Susan Nagersmith traveled to Wildwood with friends to celebrate Memorial Day weekend in May 1990. At some point during a night of partying, she became separated from her group. A witness later recalled that Susan had become extremely intoxicated at a party and that he tried to escort her back to her motel. She wandered off, and he eventually left her near the area where she was later found. On May 27, 1990, Susan's body was discovered behind a Wildwood restaurant in an alley. An autopsy confirmed that Susan had been indecently assaulted, and her blood alcohol level was more than 3 times the legal limit for intoxication. In other words, she was brutally attacked while incredibly vulnerable. Despite the evidence of a crime, local authorities inexplicably ruled Susan's death accidental in the initial investigation. Susan's relatives suspected that officials were covering up the crime to protect Wildwood's tourist-friendly reputation. The Nagersmith family pressed law enforcement for years to treat Susan's case as the slaying it truly was. After persistent advocacy, officials finally reclassified the case about 3 years later. Unfortunately, by that time, much critical evidence had grown cold, and no suspects were identified in the early 1990s. The investigation stalled, leaving Susan's case to languish as an infamous cold case in the community. One piece of evidence preserved from 1990 would eventually crack the case: DNA from an unknown male recovered from Susan's body. For years, this DNA profile didn't match anyone in criminal databases. By 2015, investigators openly said they had the perpetrator's DNA and were waiting for a hit, even uploading the profile to international databases to widen the search. That hit finally came thanks to genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge technique that emerged in the late 2000s. This innovative approach pointed to a New Jersey man named Jerry Rosado as a likely match for the mysterious DNA. Detectives obtained a direct DNA sample from Rosado in May 2021 to confirm the findings, and it was a definitive match to the biologic found on Susan. After 31 years, the investigation finally had a named suspect, linked by hard evidence. Jerry Rosado, 62 years old and from Millville in Jersey, hadn't previously been on anyone's radar in Susan's case. Once his DNA connection was confirmed, investigators worked quickly to strengthen their case. They re-interviewed the witness who had seen Susan on the night she died. In early 2022, that witness reiterated that Susan was extremely drunk and last seen in the vicinity of where her body was found, effectively helpless due to intoxication. This corroborating testimony helped establish the circumstances of the crime. On April 8, 2022, authorities arrested Jerry Rosado and charged him with essay, accusing him of taking advantage of Susan while she was incapacitated by alcohol. The charge carried a potential prison sentence of 5 to 10 years. Notably, no other charge was filed at that time, as investigators lacked enough evidence to prove who directly caused Susan's death in that alley. Still, the arrest was hailed as a long overdue breakthrough. But then things started going off the rails, on a legal technicality of all things. Identifying a suspect was a huge step, but holding him accountable proved complicated. The allegations against Rosado occurred so long ago that legal time limits became a major obstacle. In 1990, New Jersey had a 5-year statute of limitations on essay cases, although the state removed that limit in 1996. The change wasn't retroactive, and by 1995, the window to prosecute Susan's assault had already closed. Authorities argued that statutes of limitation were meant to protect suspects from faded memories and lost evidence, not to let a perpetrator escape a late DNA revelation. Rosado's defense lawyers quickly moved to dismiss the charge, citing the expired statute of limitations. In March 2023, an appellate court agreed and ordered the case against Rosado dismissed as time-barred. He had spent 11 months in jail awaiting trial, but now he was released due to this technicality. Prosecutors appealed to the New Jersey Supreme Court, but in December 2023, the High Court unanimously upheld the dismissal. Because of the legal time bar, Jerry Rosado ultimately faced no trial or punishment for the assault on Susan Nagersmith. Prosecutors had considered a further charge related to her slaying, but without new evidence or a confession, they decided not to file at this time. Laura Kempton was a 23-year-old student at the Portsmouth Beauty School who worked at a local gift shop and an ice cream parlor. Friends knew her as an outgoing, free-spirited young woman with a big personality who enjoyed the city's nightlife. On the night of September 27, 1981, Laura went out dancing with friends. She returned home shortly after midnight, saying goodnight to a friend on her doorstep, and went inside alone. That was the last time she was seen alive. It was a quiet Monday morning in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, when a routine police visit turned into a nightmare. On September 28, 1981, an officer arrived at Laura Kempton's apartment to serve a court summons for unpaid parking tickets. Instead, he found the front door damaged and ajar, and Laura's lifeless body inside. She had been subject to an indecent assault and brutally slain, a shocking act of violence that shattered the coastal city's sense of safety. At the scene, the cops found signs of a break-and-enter and a violent struggle. The weapon used to bludgeon Laura was likely a wine bottle which lay nearby. They also found a discarded cigarette butt on the floor, which hinted that the perpetrator had lingered at the scene, since Laura didn't smoke. These items would later prove crucial in identifying the depraved perpetrator. News of the horrific crime spread quickly around Portsmouth, and police vowed to find the attacker. Portsmouth police launched an intensive investigation, deploying numerous detectives to work the case. They interviewed Laura's friends, neighbors, and co-workers to reconstruct her final hours. Investigators discovered that an envelope of cash Laura kept in her apartment was missing after the crime, suggesting the perp may have robbed her during the attack. Crucially, forensic evidence was also collected, including biological samples, the cigarette butt, and the wine bottle, which years later yielded the DNA profile of a male suspect. However, in 1981, DNA technology was in its infancy and didn't yet have a direct forensic usage, and at any rate, there was no database to match that profile to a name. Despite extensive effort, no suspect was identified at the time. Every lead and person of interest ultimately yielded nothing, and as the months turned into years, Laura's case went cold. Over 40 years after the crime, investigators finally got the break they needed. In 2022, Portsmouth police and state forensic experts decided to apply forensic genetic genealogy to the Kempton case. The unknown DNA profile from the crime scene was uploaded to a public genealogy database where it produced matches to distant relatives of the potential suspect. By building out a family tree from those genetic hits, detectives homed in on one name, Ronnie James Lee. In mid-2023, additional DNA testing confirmed that Ronnie James Lee's DNA exactly matched the crime scene evidence, definitively identifying him as the perpetrator. Ronnie James Lee was 21 years old at the time of Laura's slaying and lived in Portsmouth with no known personal connection to her. This lack of any link to the victim helps explain why he was never on the cops' radar. Lee had served in the army and later worked as a security guard in town, but he also had a hidden history of violence. In the early 1980s, he was linked to a string of burglaries and pleaded guilty to several break-ins around Portsmouth. Then in 1987, he was convicted of a home invasion in which he conducted an indecent assault against a woman. This pattern of burglary and illicit violence fit the profile of Laura's case, suggesting he may have broken in looking for valuables and then attacked Laura when he found her at home. However, Ronnie Lee would never face justice. In 2005, he died at age 45 from a substance overdose. Of course, with the suspect deceased, no arrest could be made. Authorities announced that if Lee were still alive, he would have been charged in her slaying, and in July 2023, the case was officially closed. It was a warm afternoon in Honolulu on January 7, 1972. Inside a small Waikiki apartment, 19-year-old Nancy Anderson's roommate awoke from a nap to the sound of running water. She groggily stepped into Nancy's bedroom and stumbled upon a nightmare. Nancy lay lifeless on the floor, blood everywhere. In shock, the roommate ran for help and called police, thinking in the moment she might have done this herself. This wasn't to say that Nancy had expressed any such desire, but that the roommate simply found the idea of such an attack completely inconceivable. But officers quickly realized this was a brutal attack. Nancy Anderson had moved to Hawaii just a few months before her slaying, looking for adventure. She was fresh out of high school in Michigan and ready to start her life. She saved up money from waitress jobs and set off to find herself in paradise. By the fall of 1971, Nancy was settling into island life, and she shared a Waikiki apartment with a roommate and worked at a local McDonald's, making new friends along the way. Nancy was known as a kind-hearted and trusting young woman, the sort of person who saw the good in everyone. For a teenager from the mainland, Hawaii seemed like the perfect place to figure out her future. Nancy's family was of course worried about having their daughter so far away, and less than 3 months after Nancy arrived, her family's worst fears came true. The call home informing them of Nancy's death came on January 8, 1972, the same day her siblings were attending a memorial for their late father. The entire Anderson family, Nancy was one of 10 children, was devastated beyond belief. Honolulu police launched an intensive investigation. They learned that earlier on the day of the attack, 2 door-to-door knife salesmen had knocked at Nancy's apartment, hoping to sell kitchen knives. Detectives tracked down these salesmen. Both young men cooperated fully. They even volunteered fingerprints and took polygraph tests, passing them. It appeared they had nothing to do with the crime, despite what appeared to be an odd coincidence at the time. Investigators also interviewed a man Nancy had dated a few times, and even the apartment building's manager. All of them had alibis or lack of evidence tying them to the scene. Every obvious lead turned into a dead end. Police did have one critical piece of evidence. In the bathroom, they found a bloody towel that didn't belong to Nancy. It suggested the perpetrator might have cut himself during the frenzied attack, leaving behind his own blood. This was the only biological material from the attacker found at the scene. Unfortunately, in 1972, there was no DNA testing available to identify the attacker from that blood. Detectives could do little with it at the time except preserve it and hope that one day technology might catch up. Decades later, when DNA profiling became standard, the sample from the towel was entered into national databases, but it never produced a hit. But back to 1971, with no weapon recovered, no eyewitnesses, and no prime suspect, and all suspects ruled out, the case began to stall out in a big way. After exhausting their leads, the Honolulu Police Department gradually had to move on to other cases. Nancy's slaying, once a high-priority investigation, went unsolved. Months turned into years, then into decades. The file on Nancy Anderson's case gathered dust and eventually became the oldest cold case in Hawaii's history. Nancy's mother, Thelma, kept hoping for a break in the case until the end of her life. She passed away in 2001 at age 75, having never seen her daughter's perpetrator clapped in cuffs. Nancy's siblings, however, refused to let her story be forgotten. They persisted, periodically checking in with law enforcement and even petitioning the police to reopen the investigation. Little did they know that the breakthrough would finally come from a cutting-edge technique that wasn't even imagined back in the 1970s. Fast forward to 2019, nearly 50 years after Nancy's tragic demise. Her younger brother, Jack Anderson, had been following news of an astonishing new crime-solving tool, genetic genealogy. This technique had recently been used to unmask the original Night Stalker. If it could catch a long, elusive perpetrator in California, Jack thought, why not try it on Nancy's case? That year, he approached C.C. Moore, a renowned forensic genealogist, and Moore immediately agreed to help the Anderson family. Using advanced laboratory techniques, a DNA profile of the unknown attacker emerged. Then came the detective work. Moore uploaded this profile to public genealogy websites, where people share their DNA data in hopes of finding relatives. Bit by bit, Moore reverse-engineered a family tree from those relatives. She combed through records, looking at how the DNA matches might be related and which ancestral lines converged. From there, Moore began zeroing in on a potential suspect by considering age, gender, and location. Then, a major break came. By 2021, Moore and the Honolulu Police Department had narrowed their focus to a single name. The DNA trail and the family tree pointed to Tudor Chiarilla, a man who had lived in the same area as Nancy back in the early 1970s. In 1972, Chiarilla was a 27-year-old graduate teaching assistant at the University of Hawaii, residing in Waikiki, not far from Nancy's place. It was a location tie that made sense, and the genealogical evidence was compelling. It indicated that Tudor Chiarilla's family line was linked to the DNA from the crime scene. Investigators soon discovered more about their new suspect. Tudor Chiarilla had left Hawaii not long after Nancy's slaying and built a life on the mainland. In fact, he eventually became a prominent attorney in Nevada, even serving as a deputy state attorney general in the late 1970s. Outwardly, he was a successful, well-educated man who once ran for a spot on the Nevada Supreme Court. But there were darker rumors in his past. In 1995, Chiarilla had been arrested on accusations of kidnapping and attempting to indecently assault an ex-girlfriend, though that case was dropped and never went to trial. He managed to avoid a criminal record all those years, which explained why his DNA never popped up in law enforcement databases. Now, at age 77, this former lawyer was living a quiet, retired life in Reno, Nevada, likely unaware that the walls were closing in on a 5-decade-old case. The pieces were in place, but police needed ironclad confirmation that Tudor Chiarilla was the source of the DNA evidence. Genetic genealogy can strongly point to a suspect, but in court, nothing beats a direct DNA match. To obtain that, Honolulu detectives got an ingenious assist from the suspect's own family. They reached out to Chiarilla's adult son, John, who was living in California and apparently didn't have the best relationship with dear old Pop. In March 2022, the son willingly provided a DNA sample to authorities. The results were the smoking gun investigators hoped for. John's DNA showed that he was the biological child of whoever left the blood at Nancy Anderson's crime scene. In other words, the perpetrator was indeed John's father, Tudor Chirilla. This evidence was enough to move in on the suspect. In September 2022, Reno police, in coordination with Honolulu authorities, served a search warrant at Tudor Chirilla's apartment in Nevada. They collected a swab of his DNA for direct comparison to the crime scene evidence. Just 2 days after police took his DNA sample, the 77-year-old attempted to end it all on his own terms. He survived and was subsequently arrested, being forced to face justice. However, on Christmas Day, 2023, before a trial could ever take place, 78-year-old Tudor Chirilla died at a hospital while in custody. The official cause was sepsis from an infection, exacerbated by his declining health. In the days prior, he had refused food, water, and medication, almost as if he had resigned himself to his fate. With his death, Tudor Chirilla took to the grave any personal secrets or motives that might explain why he did what he did to Nancy Anderson. Even without a formal conviction, the resolution of the case brought immense solace to the Anderson family. After 52 years of pain and uncertainty, they finally knew who was responsible for Nancy's death. Chirilla's demise while behind bars was its own form of justice, since he was denied the right to die a free man or perish on his own terms.